Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of my podcast, which will basically be looking at history within the Great Gatsby movies. So, as you guys probably know, the Great Gatsby books were written by Fitzgerald in the 1920s, and they are placed in the 1920s. The movie was written in the 1970s, and the second movie, the adapted movie, was made in 2013. So, what I'm going to be looking at today is both the history of how you see the history of the 1920s, which was obviously a very important time in our economy. How is it incorporated into the Great Gatsby movies? So I'm going to start with the question, how historically accurate was the Great Gatsby? Now, we have to start with the fact that the characters are fictional. They're based off of the novel, The Great Gatsby, and they are not based off of any real historical figures, nor are they telling any real historical story. So it's not a movie portraying a specific historical event. In fact, the closest match to any historical figures that would be portrayed by the Great Gatsby or of any Fitzgerald's books would actually be Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda, as they were both debutantes of their time, who had similar ways to that of Tom and Daisy and Gatsby, and that's where a lot of Fitzgerald himself traveled to France and lived this very extravagant lifestyle with similar people, so that would actually be your closest historical figure. However, I found that the movie does portray many of the social, economic, and political dynamics of the time period that we're looking at. So just as a quick recap, in the 1920s, we saw a very lax form of government. We were seeing the increase of the stock markets. They were booming. The economy was great. We were seeing, and you were also seeing, especially when you're looking back on it, really extravagant and beautiful styles. You were seeing incredible parties. We were just coming out of World War I. And so I thought that The Great Gatsby did a great job of showing that and showing the allure of that, which I talked about a little bit in the last episode, but then also showing kind of a more comprehensive understanding of what the historical dynamics were like in the 1920s. Okay, so the first question I had were, how did the materialistic qualities of the 1920s manifest themselves in the movies? So I thought that this was really important because when I was learning about the 1920s in our history unit, I think something that we talked a lot about was not only the materialism of the ultra-wealthy when you saw all these incredible parties and the boom of new technologies and new cars, but how that was actually a sentiment that was echoed by all socioeconomic classes. However, obviously, the wealthy were able to kind of more achieve that dream. So something that I saw within one of the first scenes that kind of shows this is the really incredible buildings, like when you see both the Gatsby's palace and then you see the Buchanan's home. But then specifically in both the 2013 movie and the 1970s movie, there's the scene where Nick Carraway walks into Daisy Buchanan's house, and they go into the room with all the windows and these white drapes and these white couches. And in both scenes, I thought that it created this really beautiful and alluring image. It almost seemed heavenly. And I thought that kind of showed you, that was a good way of seeing how the materialistic qualities of the 1920s were kind of imagined. It showed you the allure of the 1920s, of that kind of money and that kind of luxury. And then another really iconic symbol within the movies that I thought really showed the materialistic qualities of the movie were the cars, because you see all of these cars, and specifically what I thought about was that iconic yellow car that Gatsby drives and that Daisy hits Myrtle with. It's that bright yellow car, and you can see specifically, I thought the cars were a good way of showing how the people of the 1920s were really obsessed with this new wave of consumerism and getting the newest technologies possible. You saw the technologies of the dishwasher and other modern home appliances, and people were in the 1920s were really desperate to get that. And what we saw in the 1920s because of that was the increase of the use of credit, which eventually, because people thought that they had more money than they did, led to the stocks crashing, and it led to a lot of people in that middle class actually that led us to the Great Depression. So I thought that was an important thing to look at. And then also So a quote that I saw that kind of went into that idea, and specifically the materialism of the cars, was people would rather go without a meal than without gas. And so that was from one of my notes from the 1920s. So it kind of shows you that even though this was a fictional rendering, you could see that those mindsets were mirrored. And then another, specifically looking at the movie, another way that consumerism is shown is through the interactions between Wilson and Tom, and how when you see in the movie, Wilson always asks Tom when he's going to sell him his car, and you see that interesting parallel of the kind of the poor proletariat. He's basically always begging Tom to get this new technology, and you see that Tom always pushes it off. And to me, that seemed like an interesting parallel of kind of looking at those who were in the middle class and the lower classes striving for the same technologies that the extremely wealthy people of the 1920s had. So then, kind of going on, another aspect of the materialistic qualities of the 1920s were the costumes, which were absolutely beautifully done in both presentations. The one costume that came to mind when I was thinking about the materialism was Daisy's costume in the 2013 movie. When she meets Gatsby at his party, she's got this beautiful, like, embellished shawl and this little, like, fur hat, and it really showed you it's just such a luxurious outfit, and you could see it shows her wealth, and it's one of the famous quotes in the book is actually that her voice sounded like money, and to me that kind of showed you throughout this entire thing, when you're looking at those wealthy people, they are showing everything that they have. And then so kind of branching off from the more materialistic side, but looking at the costumes of both the 1970s movie and the 2013 movie, I wanted to look at Jordan Baker's costume. So if you've seen Jordan Baker in either of the renditions of the movies, she's got the very typical flapper girl outfits on. She's got her hair cut short into that bun, or not into a bun, but into a bob-like hairstyle. She's wearing those very, like, slim, low draping dresses, and I thought that was really interesting, her allusions to the flapper girl, because of her own character, and it felt that it was kind of an allusion to the flapper, who was a kind of girl in the 1920s who was kind of revolutionizing the ideas of women, a very independent attitude. You were seeing changes in fashion and also changes in morale, and I thought that worked really well with Jordan's character, because we see not only is she independent, but she almost takes on a manly role within the book. You can see that she has her own profession as a golfer. She's also seen as someone who kind of defies the morals of her time, specifically when she cheats on her golf match, and we see that little moment where she just lies, and it's a really interesting idea. Okay, so then the next question I wanted to ask was, how is the economic scene of the 1920s portrayed? So the largest thing I saw about the economic properties in the 1920s was the economic disparity. Because even though most of The Great Gatsby focuses in on the beautiful and the incredible allure of the wealth, you do see when they drive from the West Egg and the East Egg into New York, they go through that really desolate coal mining place. And I thought that was really interesting to show. That was really interesting to show kind of what the difference between, just in that close range between the ultra wealthy and the ultra poor. And I thought that worked really well for a historical part of the sense, because when we were learning about this unit in class, what we realized is, even though you primarily, like when you learn about the 1920s, you're hearing about all that extravagance, the majority of Americans were living below the poverty line, and it was incredibly, so you were only seeing a part of that idea. And I thought that the movie did a great job of showing that economic disparity was there, but like our history books and like the way we remember the 1920s, focusing on the beauty and the glitter. So then another part of the movie that I thought worked really well with that was the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg. And as I talked about in my last podcast, you see that Wilson says that the eyes see everything and that the eyes are God. And I thought that was an interesting parallel to the same attitude that people had in the 1920s about capitalism and consumerism, and kind of worshiping that idea. So then the next thing, and then the final thing about the economic properties that I thought the movies did very well was the idea of extreme wealth, specifically when you were seeing kind of those expensive, like when you were seeing Tom and Daisy's houses. I thought they did a great job of showing kind of the extreme highs and lows of the 1920s as far as economics went. Okay, so then the next question I had was, how did the social dynamics of the time period impact the movies? So, on one hand, I thought that female empowerment was an interesting idea that you saw throughout the movies, and I thought that there was a dichotomy between Jordan and Daisy. Now, I already talked a little bit about Jordan and how she kind of embodied the flapper personality, and I thought that was important given the 1920s was right before women were given the right to vote, so that was a very new change as far as social norms went. And you saw that throughout her strong character, and you also saw that the relationship between Daisy and Nick becomes kind of abandoned and obsolete quickly throughout the book. Whereas with Daisy, I think Daisy kind of shows her struggle, and specifically, as you see in the end of at the end of the movie, she decides not to stay for Gatsby's funeral. She basically abandons him and goes off with Tom to continue her life. And you see, and while as an audience we tended to villainize her for that, I think that her character does show specifically that even though women had gained the right to vote, there was still a lot of bias and misogyny within their society, specifically when in the scene where she's talking about her daughter and she's talking about how she hopes she'll be a fool because of the treatment of women in the 1920s. And something I noticed specifically between the 1970s movie, the 2013 movie, was Daisy's helplessness actually seemed emphasized in the newer version. And I think that what I learned from watching one to the other, I almost felt that I had more empathy for Daisy in the newer version because it seemed that there was more of an understanding of the bind she would have been in and kind of the circumstances of women in the 1920s. Then another social dynamic that I wanted to touch on that I saw within the movie that I think kind of branched out into the history of the time was the racism, specifically in one aspect where Tom's has this big speech about this book, The Rise of the Colored Empires, where he rants about how the other races are going to take over the white superiority in his country and how they feel that it's theirs to take and they must keep it. And I thought, when I watched both movies, and he's really annoying and racist in both of them, so they got that right. And I thought that was an interesting idea, kind of this defensiveness against this white superiority. And I thought that it was interesting that they brought it up specifically for the 1920s, because when I was kind of researching the 1920s and we were learning about it in our history unit, I was reading about the Jazz Age and kind of the flourishing of influential Black culture in New York specifically, but then also kind of looking at the violence of the KKK during that time. So I think it shows the movie does a good job, not necessarily as much as it does to provide context for the economic background, but does show how racial injustices were present in the 1920s. And then finally, I wanted to look at how did the political dynamics of the time period impact the movie. And the largest part of this that I saw was the prohibition movement. So we obviously know that at the end of the movie we find out that Gatsby got all his fortune from being a bootlegger, which was selling illegal alcohol. And I thought something that was interesting that was, when I was watching the 1970s movie, I actually saw more of an emphasis on Gatsby's secret about how he earned this wealth and about the money. And I thought that it was interesting that was kind of more emphasized than it was in the 2013 movie, that idea. And I think that when we were watching that, something that also came up was the representation of the bootleggers and the connection to the illegal alcohol business. And I saw that specifically with Meyer Wolfsheim. Okay, so to conclude, I really liked, while I thought that neither of these movies did a great job of showing specific specific historical parts of the 1920s, I thought it did a great job of showing the kind of more subtle background elements and the dynamics between social and political and economics. So I really enjoyed that, and thank you so much for coming to my podcast series.